This is a chapter review for Vinland Saga 203, Thousand Year Voyage, Part 12. This chapter, long awaited truth of the Markland incident. We've been waiting so long to understand this. We've been given so many hints to try to work this out. And in hindsight, I think a lot of them were obvious, and that's kind of the sign of a good mystery, to me at least, when you look back and you're like, oh my god, how did I not realize that? But it all works, it's all satisfying, and this chapter, no different. So, let's get into first previous expectations for this chapter and the Markland situation as a whole. So, my main point from my predictions was that whatever happened in Markland, it was not meant to be a violent attack. It was supposed to be some kind of message. I assumed the relationship between the Markland settlers and natives was once friendly, but then disease caused some kind of strain, and then the natives, for the sake of their own self-preservation, tried to make the settlers leave to avoid the spread of this disease, but due to their previous relationship as friends, they didn't want to kill them. So that's why, no bodies, no blood, just arrows left there. As for why there was only a single Norse settler left after all that had happened, I guessed that he chose to stay behind to help the natives. Based on his use of native words when he was explaining the amount of bodies he found, and just the fact that he wasn't in the Markland village, he was somewhere away from there, I had assumed that they had some kind of close relationship. So if he was, say, like a doctor, he may have stayed behind while the others looked for help. As for the condition he was in when he was found, he didn't seem sick, just starved, dehydrated. So I guess that after all the natives had passed, he just struggled to find his way back to Markland. I also guess that due to the survivor seemingly not being sick despite his proximity to the natives, that the Norse must be less vulnerable, if not immune, to this disease. And of course, Markland aside, I also guessed that the reason Polmuk and Nisquadjija did not show to the meeting point at the assigned time was that something had already happened in the Gippy tribe, and I narrowed this down to either disease had already reached them, which seemed quite likely with the hints of the rats at their last meeting and the fact that disease was being heavily discussed in that chapter. But I also said it might be possible that Hild's attack had already happened off screen and something had happened there. I thought that second one was way less likely, so I was pretty confident that this was related to the spread of disease. But let's see what the truth is in this chapter. So let's start the read through. So we begin here with Musekbikwe's perspective. And this is the first time I think that we're seeing him since the thing where he got his hand cut off. And we have this beautiful nature shot here. And it's to remind us of the imagery in chapter 189, his vision of the future, where this place is going to be ravaged in our past and their future. But a good amount of time must have passed since his hand was cut off. We can see here the wound is healed and it's just become a stump at the end of his arm. But we see him living off the land here. This is like their traditional way of life, not growing crops, but catching hunter-gatherer way of life. And I like this little detail here in the bottom left panel. We can see him feeding some raccoons, another fish that he caught. And it's just a nice humanizing moment for a character like him that's otherwise felt kind of mechanical in the narrative. He's like served the purpose of seeing that vision and driving the conflict forward. He hasn't really had time to just be a normal person doing kind of normal things and living his life. So I think this was just a cute detail to show the respect he has for this land, the animals, and just the environment as a whole. But he thinks to himself about his plan to move forward. So his next move, he thinks to himself, is to use his wound as a method of swaying the other Inuit tribes against the Norse. So he seems to think that because the Gitpi tribe is already so close to the Norse, and they've, fallen for their friendly act, and they don't understand the truth of their ferocious nature, he's not going to use them and make them turn on the Norse alone. He's going to use this wound to turn other tribes against them, to make this a us versus them, where these other tribes are just hearing that there are invaders and look what they've done to me, And that makes perfect sense for his plan. It's funny because I actually kind of suspected that he was going to take this route kind of long before, like right after the vision happened and then he disappeared for a while. I thought that maybe he had gone to other tribes, specifically the Markland tribe, because shortly following the incident where he saw the vision, we got the Markland incident. And that kind of lined up in an interesting way. So I thought that maybe he was trying to go convince other tribes who hadn't met these people yet. But that probably wouldn't have worked as effectively because it was just his word. Now he has the wound to show for it. And he thinks back here too about Ivar's sword, which of course he thinks of in a similar way to that future weaponry he saw, right? It's something crafted by man for the single sole purpose of effectively killing another man. That's kind of Thorfinn's whole point of the sword, and why it's different from bringing an axe, bringing a hoe, even bringing a bow. It is a weapon, well, rather, let's say a tool for killing. An axe is a tool for cutting wood, a hoe is a tool for plowing the fields, a sickle is a tool for harvesting wheat. A sword is a tool for killing somebody. And that is just like the guns he saw, the massive bombs. This is one of those weapons. It is a precursor to why humanity builds those weapons in the future. So, just throughout this whole segment, again, this theme of connecting us with the nature around him, it's being carried by his interaction with the raccoons, but also just, we keep getting shots like this at the bottom of the page of animals kind of reacting to the environment. You can see on this page there's a bird on his shoulder, and it's just connecting us with nature, and it's nice. But this sort of serenity is interrupted when Polmuk finally finds Misekpikwe. So he and his squadron have been looking for Misek for quite some time, and that's what they told Thorfinn's group that they were doing. They were going to try to find him so then they can fix this problem, explain the situation to him, talk to him, understand him, and come to peace. So, finally, Polmuk has found him, but he is alone. He's not with Nisquajit. Before we get into why he's here, I like this detail I'm noticing here about his outfit. So before, he was wearing an entirely Norse outfit, just traditional Norse civilian outfit. And this was to show, like, his growing, I guess, acceptance of Norse culture and the benefits of it. But now, when we see him here, he has this fur scarf now. It's a small detail, and it may have been added just to, add to his design, or because maybe it's colder in the current season, or something like that. But I think it's more likely that this is an intentional choice, and it's to introduce an element to his design, to his attire, that has native origin. And I think this is to illustrate that he is more divided now between these two ways of life, and we will see why that is. So Misek is quite calm here, But Polmuk just speaks with the utmost urgency. He asks for Misek to come quickly back to the Gitpi settlement. Misek refuses, but Polmuk tells him that the Nords are not trying to kill him, but either way, no time for that conversation. They need to go now. He tells Misek that if they do not hurry, the tribe will lose their chief, and this gets a reaction out of Misek, and you can just see the desperation on his face. So perspective moves back to Arnate's village, where the Markland survivor named Flot is finally telling his story. He says here at first, it seems he is the only survivor, and we will see from the story that this isn't 100% certain. So again, it just seems like he's the only survivor. We don't really know for sure. But at the bottom of the page here, we have an interesting row of reaction panels. And it's Thorfinn's crew, right? At the first panel on the right, we have Thorfinn with his full family. It's a really cute one. Gudrid looks like she's very far along in her pregnancy at this point. I wouldn't be surprised if we see the birth of this child very soon, just looking at her. But then next we have Einar and Bug Eyes sharing the next panel. And as usual, Einar is just very normal. You know, he's looking with concern, and he's paying attention, and he's worried about what could happen, and he's just having a normal reaction, and Bug Eyes is being very Bug Eyes as normal. But the reason I bring this all up is because Cordelia is included in this row in her own panel, and she's being grouped with the rest of our main crew here. But she gets her own panel. Her reaction is full focus in that panel. And this is a trend I'm kind of noticing, where when we have these big group moments, Cordelia's reaction is very often given its own focus. It's very often like highlighted, you know? And I really believe this is just another sign that she has a bigger role to play in the process of the settlement breaking down. I think watching Cordelia go through all of these trials and tribulations that are adding further and further risk and fear to this situation, we are meant to see this taking its toll on her, because it's going to mean something when war breaks out. So, Flot begins his recount of the events in Markland. He tells that their relationship with the natives there was a friendly one, where despite lacking linguistic communication, they were able to establish a good trade relationship. He identifies that they like the color red a lot, and would trade whole pelts of red rags so often that he requested that Vargar bring more on his supply deliveries. And this is, of course, it's just a minor detail to show their relationship, but I think this is interesting because it calls back to the early settlement chapters where Thorfinn was giving gifts, right? But he said it was important that they understand what each other want and conduct trade instead of gifting to establish that relationship. It's to show that there was an understanding between these two groups, and it wasn't just this passive coexistence. And also, with the red rag trade, I think it's interesting. This could be related to how the disease spread to these people. If they were regularly trading for goods brought in on the boat, rather than goods being created in the settlement, then the rats on the boat were what brought the disease, right? So it would make sense that the disease could potentially reach them through these goods that were exposed to the rats. And I think that's just an interesting distinction between these two groups, right? Why the natives of Markland got sick faster than those in the Gippy tribe where Thorfinn is. And it's because Thorfinn's group mostly trades with produced goods that they make on the farm there, you know, the wheat, the bread. And the Markland settlement is not a place of production. It was created as a trading point, a way to, I guess, a middle point between Greenland and Vinland. This is their sort of outpost, right? And they have sheep here. That was like the one thing that they were doing, and some of the people there were fishermen, I believe. So they do have some products, but that stuff is not being produced in large supply. So if they're going to have a trade relationship, it's going to be mostly imported goods. But continuing the story, when spring started, the natives had stopped coming to the village. And the settlers were concerned, and they couldn't check on them because they didn't know where they lived. So even though they had this relationship, it was very similar to the Gitpi tribe, where the natives were able to come to the Norse settlement and were freely shared that location, but the Norse in Arnate's village do not know where the Gitpi tribe live. But after 2 weeks of no contact, they're suddenly fired upon with arrows. We see that sheep here are hit with the arrows, but the people don't seem to be getting hit. And we'll see more of that in the next few pages, but it's interesting that it seems like the sheep were the high priority. And this is not very brutal either. It looks like the sheep, yes, they're in pain. It's certainly uncomfortable, but these aren't kill shots. It's interesting. But continuing, from the forest, they call out to the Nords and use a Mi'kmaq word that we don't know, but very likely, based on all the context, it is a command or a request to leave. So Flot is interrupted here with some reactions from the other settlers. We see Ivar and his brothers looking sternly here. Ivar seems more irritated, while Sturk has a look more like concern. And Conglate, he kind of just looks like usual. He's always been kind of the most, I guess, stoic one of their group. So he's just kind of being his usual intimidating self. He's definitely the least kind of fleshed out of these three. So it kind of makes sense that there's more to say about Ivar and Sturk's reactions here. But the first to speak up, of course, is Mr. Huggy. And paranoid as usual, he claims this is evidence that the new will suddenly turn on them, and they need to act now. And an unnamed settler says, just hear him out, Mr. Huggy. And, well, this is just a random guy, and it's not that important of a line. I do think this helps us get a decent read on general opinion from the settlers. Despite their fear and the precautions that they're taking against war, they do understand that things are not that simple, and they're not all hyper paranoid like Uggy is. But then Flot continues. At first, the Markland settlers did not understand what made the natives suddenly turn hostile. He says that since the attack, the natives continued to rain arrows on them day and night, always attacking from the forest without entering the village. So it's important to note here, despite the lengthiness of this attack, it was done over multiple days and nights. None of the Norse were ever killed. In fact, it would seem they never even got hit. But when things continued to get more dangerous, the Markland settlers eventually talked about leaving. Flot wanted to go back to Greenland, but the others wanted to move the settlement to another location instead. And this argument culminated in them leaving Flot behind and leaving him to deal with these continuous attacks alone. And Thorfinn briefly says here that he's glad Flot is safe, and then Flot continues. Eventually, he got hit with one of the arrows. It doesn't seem like it was a very significant injury. Much like with the sheep, I'm sure it caused pain, but it doesn't seem like it was a, very brutal attack. He says he got hit in the behind, so And he, he talks about it like it wasn't a big deal. He says, I thought I was done for. Of course, anyone's going to be afraid when they get attacked. But ultimately, it doesn't seem like that injury was significant. Still, this prompted Flot to hide in the mountains and live off fruit and berries there. So, of course, this explains why he was so malnourished, dehydrated. He was just hiding in the wilderness. He even says here that he heard Thorfinn banging the pots. And this was from chapter 192, the first 1,000-year voyage chapter, where we first learn about the Markland incident, and Thorfinn was banging on the pots to try to get any contact established with anybody nearby. However, Flot believed that this was possibly the sound of the natives celebrating their victory, So, of course, he's not going to come out from hiding just because he hears a sound. Thorfinn comments here that this was in early summer when they had been to Markland. So this means that for the entirety of spring, and possibly into the early summer, the Markland natives had been attacking the settlement. So this was not just a one-time attack. This was a prolonged attack to drive the Markland settlers away. If this was an attack meant to just kill them, it would not have been this long process like this. But after all that time, Flot getting hit seemed to be the only injury that came from this attack. At least, to a human. Sorry, sheep. But when Thorfinn was there, there wasn't a single sign of native presence, and this leads Flot to the most important part of the story, and the reason why there was no trace of people when Thorfinn got there. One day, when he was catching fish in the river, the body of a Markland native came down the stream. Flot thought this was a sign that a village was upstream, and that something bad happened there. So he followed, hoping for some answers to all of his questions, and answers he got. When he found them, all of the adults, children, were dead without a burial. Thorfinn is shocked, and you just see this shock and dread washing over his face. And then, suddenly, we cut back to the perspective of the Gitpi tribe, and we see a full page illustrating the devastation that they are currently experiencing. And we know now why Polmuk and Nisquaji did not show up to the meeting. We see people laid out on the ground, and we're unsure if they're dead or maybe just being treated, and they're resting. In the foreground, one native man is being carried away, most likely dead. And we see a tragic image in the background here where a child is reaching out for a woman who is likely their mother, lying on the ground, and whatever her fate is, this is haunting. We see the expressions of Misik and Polmuk looking at this as we are. Polmuk has a very pained expression. He's already aware of this situation, but it's just as difficult to look at. Misik has a look on his face, and it looks remarkably like Thorfinn's from before. It's this same shock and dread at what they're looking at. And I think this is really interesting as a small detail, showing that these two characters, despite their huge differences, are having a common reaction to this disease. And of course, it's a normal reaction. I'm not shocked like, oh, they're more alike than we thought. This is a very human way to react to a epidemic like this. But I'm sure Misik would never have imagined that Thorfinn would be sharing it with him. And that's what makes it interesting to me. It's not a surprise to us, but I'm certain it would be a surprise to him. In this middle panel here, we see more people laid on the ground, one being covered and another being carried away, implying more deaths as flies buzz around. One girl is laying between these two dead people, and her pained expression shows she seems to still be alive. Beside her is a necklace, and for some reason, this sticks out to me. It feels like it takes her from a background character to a real person. It makes me ask, did she take it off because it was uncomfortable, and any desperate attempt to find comfort in her situation? What does it mean to her? Did she make it herself? Was it given to her? I hope she makes it through this. But Pulmuk tells us he was the first to fall victim to the disease, and although he was cured, it continued to spread from one person to another. And thinking back to the last meeting he had with Thorfinn's group, where we saw the rats around them, it seems very likely that was the moment he caught it and brought it to his people. This also tells us that despite the severity of this disease that we are seeing, it can be treated. And those who recover, like Pulmuk, are less vulnerable afterwards. He goes on to explain some aspects of this disease as we're shown another man suffering. It causes a high fever. It makes skin turn black, and we see from looking at the victims that it seems to start around the hands and the feet. And weaker people, like children and the elderly, are especially vulnerable to dying from it. Pulmuk asks Misek for help, and Misek directs him to collect some medicinal herbs and feed porridge to any of the sick who are able to eat to help them recover their strength. And this is an important moment, at least to me. I think because we're seeing for the first time Misek play his role as a healer for these people. We've seen him as a spiritual advisor, which has been his primary focus, and that is part of his role to these people. But as the Puowin of the tribe, and of all the tribes in this area, he's not only an advisor, but he is a spiritual healer. He is as extremely valuable as a doctor to these people. He is the only person that can turn to handle this situation. But this prompts Misek to ask if Chief Gippy is safe, and Pulmuk's reaction here tells us the worst. Inside the chief's home, Gippy lays wheezing weakly. Misek looks down sadly, and then he is shocked and pained to see Nisquaji is weak as well. His attention is brought back to Gitpi, who thanks him for coming. Misek tries to tell him not to force himself, but Gitpi continues, apologizing and asking him to take care of his family. Misek tells him not to be sorry and blames himself for not preventing this, as it was similar to the widespread of disease he saw in his vision of the future. He identifies the disease as a curse brought onto them by the Norse, one that the Norse are not vulnerable to. And then we again return to Flot in the village. And we get another row of these 3 reaction panels, just like we did in the beginning, but instead of Thorfinn's crew, this time it's made up of Ivar, Uggi, and Cordelia. And this is extremely interesting to me. Again, Cordelia has her own panel focusing on her reaction among this group, but this time, she is paired with characters we know are fearful and make rash decisions. I believe this is to show her internal dilemma, shifting between compassionate desire to understand, like Thorfinn's group, and fear of what could happen to them, like these two. And again, I just think this is Yukimura is saying, pay attention to Cordelia. Watch what she does and how she's reacting. But at the bottom here, we get another reaction of Thorfinn after learning about the disease, and the look of shock on his face is now transitioned to just a pained worry. The background here behind him is extremely loud and messy. It's imagery to show Thorfinn struggling to process this information and conjure a solution. He puts together here that their presence has brought death to these people. No matter how indirect it is, his expedition has already taken lives, and he knows it. But Sturk, calm and smart as he usually is, puts together that the disease must have been something that the natives have not experienced before, and that they must have concluded that the logical recent event that could have caused it would be their contact with the Markland settlers. Like Thorfinn, he has grasped the situation, but he does not share Thorfinn's expression, nor the same loud and messy background, and this is to show that he is not looking at this with the same emotional intelligence towards the implications of this development. And this is so consistent with what we learned about him before Hild's attack, how he knows what they are doing is going to make things worse. He knows war is not actually coming without their action, but he doesn't have the emotional intelligence to truly understand what they are doing and what they are bringing onto the native people and themselves. But he continues, saying that the attacks were done with bows because they were too afraid to get close. And this is technically true, but the wording here does seem to imply that he doesn't fully understand the attack itself being more of a threat than a real attack. Or at least that is our assumption from what we have gathered. He goes on to comment about how they may have brought the disease to Vinland unintentionally, but he is interrupted by Ivar. And Ivar cockily says this is actually great, because they get to live while the natives die. Despite everything that happened with Hild and him learning that Sturk doesn't really think the natives want war, he is still thinking of this as a battle to be won. And as much as this does disappoint me to see from him, as I kind of thought the moment with Sturk after Hild's attack would be a bit of a turning point for him, it does make sense. This man is not going to give up his entire way of thinking and way of life just because of that one incident. But this doesn't just make me angry. Vargar looks angrily as well, and Ivar prods him. What's up, old man? You know? And Vargar gives a grin before driving a punch right into Ivar's face. Ginglati immediately charges at Vargar in a rage while Sturk goes to help. And Thorfinn desperately tries to stop the fight. This is the first instance of physical infighting on this expedition, and I am certain it will not be the last. And another interesting point, look at the background characters. We see some of the settlers are cheering on, and of course, this reminds me of the countless duels we've seen in this series. And it kind of shows us that Viking culture has not been entirely left behind on this expedition. But we return to the perspective of the Gitpi, where we see a funeral pyre. Among many other bodies lies Chief Gippy. And we see the black skin had spread to his head and his fingers. And this marks a very significant moment in this arc. And this is our first named character death. Despite him being probably the least fleshed out of the main native characters, being Polamuk Nisquajic and Misakwe, I really liked him ever since he gave his speech at the thing. I'm very sad to see him go. And we just see echoes of the respect the tribe had for him as they weakly cry out his name. Misiek tries to put Polmuk at ease, saying that the fire cleanses the dead and will free Gitpi from the curse. And I think this is an interesting character moment for him, where the others are drowning in emotion right now. Misiek is focusing on his spirituality and his duty to his people, and that's just so consistent. But Polmuk, filled with grief and guilt, blames himself as he was the one to bring this disease to his tribe. He was the first to get sick, and it spread from him. He asks Misiek what is he to do now? And Misiek tells him to prevent the further spread of disease and avoid contact with the other tribes for some time. And this is interesting, and I'll come back to it. But when he turns away and walks into the tree line as the tribe calls out to him, begging for his guidance, he is fully enshrouded in darkness and thinking they must prevent any more disasters from spreading. Again, the most dangerous man is driven to action. And that ends the chapter. So let's get into analysis. This chapter was just incredibly dense and heavy. There's so much to discuss here. So let's start with Markland. Of course, how could we not start there? So, spared for some details that were obviously very difficult to predict, I think we were correct in many of our guesses here. There was a friendly relationship between the settlers and the natives. The survivor was left behind by the others, and although it was not explicitly confirmed, we have further evidence that the attack was more of a threat rather than a real violent attack. And the settlers ultimately made the decision to leave rather than being completely forced to. And this is, of course, a matter of relativity and perspective. In a way, yeah, they were kind of forced to. They were getting arrows rained down on them constantly, but it wasn't like a sudden attack that they had to leave or else they'll die. It was just a constant discomfort and fear that eventually made them make the decision themselves to leave. And I think that's an important distinction either way. But I was wrong about some things. The reason one man was left behind was as simple as there just being a disagreement. I thought this man stayed behind with a purpose. You know, he had a reason. He wanted to stay and help. But no, they just didn't agree, so they left him. I thought there was also a closer relationship between the two groups. We did get it confirmed that, yes, they did have a close relationship, but as far as the idea of Flop being someone who was staying there to help them, and that they were dealing with this thing together, that's not the case. The settlers were not even aware of where the natives lived. He found them off chance. I thought that the arrows were left as a warning message for the other Norsemen. But it is more likely that they simply just didn't want to get close to protect them. To collect them, which makes sense. They were trying to protect themselves, you know. So, in hindsight, I feel like it was a well set up mystery. But man, I really should have noticed some of these things. It seems like they're so obvious looking back. I'm really surprised I didn't make the disease connection earlier, but whatever. But there's still the question of the fate of the other natives. The other settlers. We know they left, but we don't know what happened to them. And there is a possible answer already given to us, but we'll come back to that shortly. So let's talk about the disease itself, the one that we are seeing the Gippy tribe going through. I've tried to look into what this disease could be, what it might be, at least based on considering the symptoms, but I haven't had much luck. The disease was, at least the disease that is most commonly attributed to killing a significant portion of the Native American population, and a disease which we likely saw in the glimpse of the future from Misiek, was smallpox and measles. And of course, the symptoms we see in this chapter don't fit this. We don't see any bumps on the skin or anything like that. And of course, then, the Black Plague comes to mind. When you think of plagues and disease, black skin, like, the Black Plague is the epidemic, you know? And as much as this is making sense with the symptoms, the Norse immunity aspect and the time period makes it kind of not make sense. I am inclined to believe that this is meant to be a disease kind of related to the Black Death, but ultimately one that is made up for the sake of the story. And, due to how little concrete information exists about this time period, especially the events of Viking settlement in North America, making this disease up really isn't a huge deal. But, that being said, if anyone has any idea of what this could be, I'd like to hear it. So, although this mostly comes from the character's assumptions rather than explicit proof, it does seem like the Norse are immune to the disease, considering how Flot had come into close contact with the remains of the Markland settlers, and Thorfinn's group has been living with the rats this whole time without issue. All of this gets a bit confusing, though, when we look back on the previous chapter with this information on mind. Of course, I have to shout out Elite Ari for noticing this. I didn't notice this myself, but some of the disease victims we saw in Knut's side of the world also had the same symptom of the black skin, mostly on the hands and the feet. With this in mind, and considering it came from a washed-up ship, this does seem to imply that the same disease is at play here, and that is the missing Markland ship. However, this would contradict the idea that the Norse are immune to the disease, as it quickly spread throughout this village, and it was dangerous enough that Knut chose to kill the sick as a means of stopping it. So in order for this to be the same disease, and for that ship to be the Markland ship, we would either have to be wrong in our assumption that the Norse are immune, or the disease would have had to mutate at some point after the Markland settlers left. I am no disease expert, and I will not pretend to be, but a sudden mutation like this does not seem very likely. I'm more inclined to believe that the ship is a red herring, and that Yukimura just chose to illustrate these diseases in a similar way. Although, of course, part of me feels like that's not enough faith in Yukimura, but it's a point to consider for sure. But there's also the possibility that Knut's side was meant to set up the idea that this disease has the potential to infect the Norse if it mutates in Vinland, or if they're not careful, or something like that. So it is essentially to say they are not guaranteed to be safe from it forever. The shared symptoms and the source being a washed-up ship feel like they very explicitly want us to draw the connection between these two events, but right now it is hard to say for sure when the detracting factors against that idea cannot be ignored. So, let's talk about Misek and the Gitpi tribe. I really like the choice to have this chapter start with that quiet moment of Misek alone. As I said before, it is an important moment to inject some humanity into him, and places us in his shoes for a bit. Ever since the vision, we have mostly seen him function for the plot, and he just hasn't really had time to live his life, and for us to see that. The focus on nature around him as well just goes a step further to remind us, what is he doing this for, and what will happen to this beautiful place in the future. And real quick, let's talk about Nisqually. There's not much to say about her here. She's easily one of my favorite characters at this point in the story, and I'm very sad she is sick, right? But with how she's been set up, I highly doubt she would die here. That just wouldn't make sense for Yukimura's writing style. Deaths in Vinland Saga, even though there's a lot of, unnamed character death, background character deaths, when a main character dies, a character functional in the plot, it is a important moment. He does not do it without it serving a purpose. There really isn't a purpose besides shock to killing Nisqually. But having her out of commission for a bit is a big deal. she is meant to be the bridge between these two people, right? So if something were to happen while she's sick, then communication would just be even more difficult. So I think that is the reason she has been put in this position. But let's, of course, talk about the death of Gitpi. As I said before, despite his relatively low presence in the narrative, this death really hurts to see. This is also the first time in a very long time that we have had a named character die in Vinland Saga. If you exclude sort of one-off named characters from Baltic Sea War, which we had quite a few, this may be the first named character death since Arnheid, which is, that's a big deal. And of course, he's not on the same level of Arnheid, but this is certainly the most significant death since then. If I'm misremembering something, of course, please let me know. But it's a big deal. And of course, this is sure to have a big effect considering the role he played and how the tribe has reacted. Before, when the tribe would discuss things as a group, Gitpi was always a very level-headed leader, very sincere and understanding. The tribe generally followed and trusted in his decisions and valued his word highly, but now, with his death, we see them turn to the one leader they still have left, their Puowen, Misekpikwe. They've lost the leader that binded them and supported their relationship with the Norse, and in his place is the man who warned them of this disaster and wants to drive the Norse out. And of course, the effect this all has on Pulmuk is very interesting. His position as one of the most pro-Norse people in the tribe makes him the perfect character to have bring disease to his people. He blames himself for bringing this onto them as the first person to get sick, and I want to see how this will change his stance on the Norse. The big factor that made him pro-Norse, aside from, of course, the kindness they showed him, the growing friendship, was the potential to learn from them to improve the quality of life for him and his people. Now, this close interaction with the Norse has brought absolute destruction onto them. We can't blame him, of course. He's an innocent victim in all this, but that will not stop him from putting himself at fault. When Misek warned them of the vision, Pulmuk said to him that although he values Misek's advice as their spiritual leader, he and the others can't see what he saw. And what they do see is the positive benefits of integration with the Norse. Now, though, with this incident and him seeing Ivar's sword, which was a moment that was given a lot of focus as well, he has seen the spread of disease and the weapons of destruction right in front of him. With Misek leaving again and Gitpi gone, Pulmuk will likely be forced to stand in as a leader. And with all that in mind, how will he direct them? But let's talk about Misek's next move. Earlier in the chapter, we learned that his plan was to use the wound on his arm to turn the other tribes against the Norse. Now, after all that has happened, it's unclear if that is still his current plan, but when he leaves, he tells Pulmuk to avoid contact with other tribes for some time. Of course, this is to prevent the spread of disease, but it could also double as a means of preventing the Gitpi tribe from interfering with his plan to turn the other tribes against the Norse. At the same time, the text here that says a single arm did not prevent it implies that he feels there's more he must do to prevent further disasters. Personally, I don't think making the other tribes fight the settlers would be as impactful as the Gitpi tribe alone turning on their former friends, so I hope that isn't the case. But still, considering now that even more significant number disadvantage that the Gippy tribe is at after all these losses, they would probably need to bring in other tribes for a war either way. So, I definitely don't think that the other tribes that with unnamed characters we don't care about are suddenly going to attack alone without the Gitpi tribe. The Gitpi tribe will absolutely be involved when war breaks out. But whatever the case, Masek's fears are now reality before him, so he will certainly be acting with more urgency and desperation. But let's talk about Thorfinn and the settlers. Now that he knows they have brought disease upon the native people of Vinland, how will Thorfinn react? An important thing to note here, as far as Thorfinn's group knows, this disease has not reached the Gippy tribe. But with Poldbuk and Nisqualji not showing to their meeting, I'm sure he'll put 2 and 2 together. I can see 2 possible reactions here for him. And it's interesting because both of these, despite their differences, they do feel in character for him in some aspect, but both involve some kind of compromise. And it's so interesting. And these 2 possible reactions are either immediately look for a way to help, or immediately leave to prevent causing further damage. The thought that him coming here already caused lives to be lost will certainly hurt him greatly, but I don't think he will just give up and leave the Gitpi to deal with this alone. Like Canute said, if he were in that situation, he would not kill people, and knowingly leaving them to die, in his eyes, is likely not much better. Assuming that they do have immunity to this disease, then he may try to use that fact to let them safely treat and stop the spread of this disease. But then again, his entire philosophy is to run as far away as he must to prevent violence. And this creates a really interesting dilemma for him, right? If their presence is bringing disease and killing people, does that count as violence? Would the choice to abandon them to this fate make it an act of violence? Is the choice to help them make it no longer an act of violence? It's interesting. It makes this gray area. What is violence and what isn't? If they are causing death, where is the line drawn? But, of course, if I had to say what was more likely, it's that Thorfinn will try to help. His thinking of their relationship with the Gippy tribe is not a neutral coexistence, but total integration. This is a them problem. Something that the 2 groups must share, rather. It's not us versus them. It is us, including them. The last thing he says in this chapter here is that they don't have time for fighting, which, of course, implies that he thinks they need to act on this issue now. And of course, this could be, we need to leave now. But I think it's more likely, we need to act now. We need to help now. And I don't think his guilt over these deaths will just prevent him from taking whatever steps he thinks will save them. So, what makes this really interesting, right? Thorfinn's optimism throughout this arc. We've been seeing it constantly. He will just look on the bright side and look towards the positive future he wants, because he feels like being optimistic will be better than being pessimistic and ending up in bringing it upon yourself, basically, by being pessimistic, right? But that optimism is going to be challenged here. The optimistic approach would be to tackle the problem alongside the Gippy tribe, to try to save them and help them. While the pessimistic approach would be to abandon Vinland to prevent further deaths and accept that he has failed. But, of course, in another way, you could absolutely see him choosing to stay, as this selfish decision to not give up his dream, despite it already claiming lives. There's a lot of layers to look at this, and that's why it's such a good dilemma to put him in. But let's say Thorfinn did choose to run away and prevent further deaths. What would happen? Although, of course, I think this is less likely, and it's certainly an interesting idea, because I don't think it would even go smoothly. Him making this choice wouldn't be like Vinland Saga has ended with Thorfinn leaving because disease ruined everything, right? How would he even be able to leave? If Thorfinn were to consider leaving, he would probably do so with a thing, like he's done for other big decisions. He values making everybody be on the same page through discussion, rather than as the leader deciding this is what we are going to do. And of course, Ivar and his followers have no reason to leave. They wouldn't say it as loudly as Ivar did here, but this disease just isn't their problem, and it benefits them. Considering the previous setup as well of Einar not wanting to lose this place he built for Arnheid, he would most likely not want to leave either, and he would probably convince Thorfinn that they should stay. Either way, I don't see him wanting to leave either. But not for the same reasons as Ivar and his group, where it's not their problem. He would want to stay and help to make it work, but also selfishly not want to abandon this place. But in the scenario where Thorfinn decides, okay, I'm just going to leave Vinland with my close family, companions, he likely wouldn't be able to leave. Ivar has already made a huge deal about how important ships are and how they need them in preparation for war, so he wouldn't just let Thorfinn leave with one. And this takes the wall that was built, they say built as protection, and now makes it into a means of keeping people who want to leave in. So Thorfinn can't just steal a ship in the middle of the night, right? They would have to go through the process of opening the gate in the wall and leaving the bay. So this scenario would most likely just lead to infighting and a full-on coup against Thorfinn, which of course would be a very, very interesting dilemma. So no matter what choice Thorfinn makes here, the dilemma itself is interesting, and the choice he makes could both lead to very interesting things. And the right choice just isn't entirely clear. So that's pretty much most of my analysis. I'll get into some overall thoughts before we just close out here. So this chapter, man, it was just incredibly dense. Things are moving fast now. Art in this chapter, I really like the art, but I have seen some people complain about background characters, and I'll find a good example here. On the native side of things, absolutely not. There's no sign of background characters looking bad, but in the big Norse discussions here, you can see some of these background characters look very kind of sketchy. This is a example here that stands out to me. This page, these two panels of background characters, they don't even really look like Yukimura's style. And this only happens, of course, for some static background characters. Any character that speaks or has a more dynamic pose is drawn like background characters usually are for Yukimura. With how the length of this chapter is and how busy both settings are, I think Yukimura was just kind of stretched a bit thin this month, and these characters were either drawn very quickly by Yukimura or maybe even drawn by an assistant. Either way, I don't think I've seen background characters look like this so close to the foreground, at least. So it's very interesting to see that. But they're still among some really, really great art and some very dynamic expressions. But art aside, I want to talk about the disease as a whole and how it's being used in the story. So one of the biggest concerns I can see with the introduction of this disease is how it will be used in the conflict and the climax of this arc. Obviously, after all the patient setup that it's gone into bringing these groups together and slowly tearing them apart through human errors like fear and miscommunication, it would be a major letdown for disease to ultimately be what causes Vinland to fail. And I don't think Yukimura would make a mistake like that. What this disease does do instead is put the characters in extreme circumstances where they need to make quick judgments. So far, characters in this arc have had the benefit of being given time to breathe in low pressure environments as they get to know each other and run into moments of miscommunication and misunderstanding. Even in these situations where pressure does get high and the two groups end up hurting each other like at the thing, they were still able to de-escalate, take a step back, and recollect themselves. Now, with this disease, it will put them under a constant pressure where they all feel like they need to act quickly to protect themselves and others. And this air of urgency will take situations where before they would take the time to communicate and understand, and will turn them into situations that can very quickly spiral out of control through misunderstandings. We already saw with Palmuk for this disease that the disease can be handled and recovery is possible. So the question now is whether or not they can safely come to that solution under these dire circumstances, considering everything set up before then. How do they solve this together? Because they can. And of course, the situation that is most likely to turn incredibly bad under these circumstances is Hild's next move. From Hild's perspective, she is looking for a single man who has separated himself from any potential allies both physically and emotionally. With him, she plans to do something similar to what she did with Ivar. She wants to have full control with careful planning to make her target have no choice but to listen to her threats of violence and her demands. However, all of this assumes she has full control of the situation. And what she doesn't know is that she is walking into a situation far messier and more unpredictable than she realizes. Her target is now the one leader the Gitpi tribe has left, the one they are turning to for guidance in this difficult time, who has warned them that the Norse will bring a death that they are now seeing the start of. This all but guarantees that Hild's actions will end up being the first act of war. If she goes and she faces far larger retaliation than she plans for, will she be forced to act on her threats of violence in order to defend herself? If she does kill Masek, will he now be a martyr figure for the native people because of them turning to him for guidance after losing Gitpi and so many others? If this disease is making the tribe question their safety with the Norse, then Hild's next action will at the very least be what verifies their fears. And at worst, it will directly result in the first murder in the war between these two groups. Let's talk next chapter predictions. I know most of my analysis in this one was kind of predictions, so oops, but this is one of those chapters where to analyze it, you have to discuss the possibilities, and that's how you see what makes this so interesting. But there's one thing I didn't discuss for predictions, and that's the chapter preview text. It says at the bottom here, for the first time in a long time, good news in Arnite's village. What comes to mind immediately for me, of course, is that this will finally be the birth of Gudrun and Thorfinn's child. Still as confident as I am that this will happen next chapter, I don't think it will just be a happy chapter. What I see happening here is Yukimura setting up a parallel events chapter similar to this one, where on one end we have the birth of this baby, the first European child born in North America. And on the other hand, we have the events that result in the start of the war between the Norse and the natives. I think of this parallel of this beautiful new life being birthed in Vinland, this symbol of hope for them, juxtaposed with tragic violence signaling the beginning of the end, and it would be incredibly powerful. At the same time, a lot of ground would have to be covered in a single chapter in order to do that. So it's less likely that we would see the full events of Hild's actions there. Maybe just a pivotal moment at the start of it. Still, no matter what happens, I suspect next chapter will be the last happy moment we will have in Vinland. And whatever good things happen here will herald the beginning of the war. But we will have to wait until next month to see. I'm very satisfied with this chapter, very happy that we got such a dense one, and I'm so looking forward to seeing what's coming next. I have such high hopes for how this is going to play out, and I'm very excited to see it all. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next month. Bye.